Swing him over here. Whoa!
Oh,
All right.
all right.
What kind is that?
I'm trying to get this out of my pocket.
Out of your pocket. Hi folks, I'm Denny Brauer. Welcome to what I think is one of the most exciting fishing videos that's ever been shot. It doesn't involve me, just a little bit. It involves my son Chad, who went to college and studied fisheries biology and has got a totally different angle on how to catch fish. He can explain the whys, the hows. You know, we go out and catch fish and we think, well, we caught him on a spinnerbait, we caught him out on a jig, we caught him in dirty water, we caught him in clear water. He's going to tell us all the secrets to help us catch more fish. Chad, how are we going to do all this?
Well, I'm glad to be here. For the next hour or so throughout this video, my sole purpose in life is to help you become a better fisherman by helping you understand how the ecosystem affects the bass and its behavior. Probably the most important point I need to start out with is to tell what is the ecosystem? What does the word ecosystem mean? Basically, it means the individual that you're talking about. Now we're talking about the bass. So we're talking about a bass ecosystem. How that particular individual interacts with both the living and the non-living pieces of its environment, meaning the bait fish, the algae, the water, even the weather. All those pieces fit into the ecosystem. Now, every time I go fishing, since I got my education, my perspective towards starting a fishing trip has changed. I look at it as a big jigsaw puzzle. It kind of is just like the ecosystem is a jigsaw puzzle. The more pieces that you can fit together each time you go fishing, the more successful you're going to be. And what I hope to do in this video for you is to get several pieces in place for you every time you hit the water. And that's going to put you that much farther ahead each time that you get on a fishing trip. And the more successful the fishing trip is, the more fun we're going to have.
In other words, you're giving them shortcuts to where to start, what lures to use, that they're keying on because of the weather, because of the actual environment.
Exactly. And the more you understand why things happen in the environment, not just that I caught them on a spinnerbait, why you caught them on a spinnerbait, that's going to improve your confidence every time you go to the water, and that's going to make you a better fisherman each time.
I know I've done a lot of how-to videos, I shouldn't say a lot, 4 or 5 I guess over the years, and we're always keying on catching fish. You know, you need to move your bait this way or that way, and you need to use this under those conditions, but what you're really doing is taking it one step further. You're giving us a starting place, a shortcut, and you know, a lot of times we look at some of this stuff as educational, it's boring, but really it's the heart of the matter.
That's right. And once you get a great understanding, I mean, fishing's 90% mental, 10% physical, and if you can improve your mental game, you're going to improve as a fisherman. Why don't we start by the most obvious piece in the world, the bass itself. If you've got that piece every time you go to the water, that's the center of your puzzle right there. And let's start with the bass. what you need to know about the bass, and the most important thing about the bass to the fisherman, is its 5 senses. The first sense, sight. Then you've got hearing, feeling, smell, and taste. Those are your 5 senses. They're the same as we have. When you're talking about fish, and bass specifically, you group those 5 senses into 3 specific categories. The first being sight. Remember that, it's the most important. Second being hearing and feeling, and the third and least important to the bass is smell and taste. Let's talk a bit more specifically about each sense and how the fisherman can use each of those senses to his advantage when he's fishing. You learn nothing else. The bass is primarily a sight feeder. And what that means to the fisherman is that that bass is going to have to see his bait before the bass is going to eat his bait. The bass is not going to randomly go around closing his eyes and eat something that he hasn't seen. It's just not going to happen. What do you got? A whiff. What you got going in here? Well, my line stopped short of the bottom. No, no. I know, I guarantee you that was the fish.
No,
You're stealing my fish.
No, that was a
This is how you treat your son.
totally different spot.
Stealing the fish that's biting on his bait.
I've got the right color jigs on.
Well, I think you might be right there.
Man. There you go.
I still think you stole that one from me.
No, I was over there. That's why if they nip you the first time, you better get them, because if you don't, somebody else might.
Especially when you got a partner who will cast in on your fish.
No, that didn't happen. I'm listening to this whining.
I feel like a hunting dog who just pointed at the quail and you shot him.
Huh.
One thing a bass fisherman definitely has to keep in mind when he's out bass fishing is that the bass can see color, and you can take that to the bank. Through the ages, that has been under a little bit of debate. People have claimed that the color of your bait really doesn't matter as long as the fish gets to see it. Well, studies have shown that bass and their eyes have rods and cones just like our eyes have. And what that means is that they can see color. Now, to what degree those bass can see color and what colors they see better than others is really hard to tell. A lot of it depends on the conditions that you're under, whether the water is dirty or clear, whether there's a lot of light coming into the water, or whether it's cloudy. We're going to get into the specifics of that in a little while. And while we're on the subject of rods and cones in their eyes, I should mention how sensitive the bass's eyes are to light. The bass's eyes are basically about 5 times more sensitive to light than ours are. On the very darkest night that you can think of, to where we couldn't see anything, a bass could sit down in the water and read a newspaper. And now that's pretty sensitive. That means that it doesn't take a lot of light for them to see something. That's why night fishing is very good in some areas, and they can also feed in very dirty water. They don't need a lot of light for them to see. But keep in mind, they can see color, and their eyes are extremely sensitive to light, a lot more so than ours are. Starting out with clear water is probably the simplest. Clear water is basically just water with a few particles in it, and you can see basically pretty far down in it. I call clear water where I can see at least 3 feet down into it. And in those situations, you mentioned going to like the green pumpkin colors or the chameleon craw colors, the natural looking baits.
Right. They actually look like a crawdad or whatever you're trying to emulate.
That's right. The bass can see very well in clear water. His vision is basically unimpaired. He can see he can detect light 5 times better than we can.
In other words, if we can see what you were saying, 3 foot into the water you call clear water, that bass can actually see a bait 15 foot away.
Yeah, that's a pretty general rule that you can go by. The bass can see 5 times better than you if you go by that rule, you're going to have a pretty good estimation of how far he can see.
Well, that stands to reason. A lot of times when I've been fishing muddy water, for instance, where you've only got 6 inches, a foot of visibility, you wonder how can that bass ever find that bait? Well, if I can see a foot, he can see 3 foot.
That's right.
It's a lot easier for him than what we realize.
Keeping with the clear water real quick, I think what you basically need to keep in mind is that you want your bait to probably look real natural in clear water because the fish can see very well. If you throw an all chartreuse jig out there and are bouncing along the bottom, sure, the fish is going to see it extremely well. He can see it from a mile away then. But it's not going to look natural to him, and he's going to say, hey, that's something I can see, but I can see so well that I can tell it's fake, and he's probably not going to eat it in that case. In clear water, something you also need to keep in mind is what colors transmit the best. In clear water, a general rule is that blue can be seen the best down deep. Black and blue, you said that's basically a universal color for jig fishing. You can fish it from dirty water to clear water. Basically, it's transmitted down in the water better than the other colors in clear water. When I talk about stained water, I'm basically talking about water that I can see, a foot to 3 foot down into. It doesn't have a large amount of dirt in it or mud, wherever you might be. Sometimes it's got a reddish tint to it from the red mud like we have in Missouri. Sometimes it's got a real brown tint to it. When I get in those situations, what I'm basically thinking is that the water is just full of dirt particles. And what those dirt particles do is the same thing that the pigments in my red shirt do. When the light comes into the water, those dirt particles either absorb the light or they reflect the light. The light that they reflect is the color that you see. So you're seeing a brown color. Well, the 3 colors that basically make up brown are your chartreuses, your yellows, your oranges, and some greens and some reds thrown in there. That range of the spectrum. Well, what colors do you basically go to in the dirty water then? Well, your Texas craw right here has got a good chartreuse base on it. Those are the colors that are being reflected. All other colors are getting absorbed and basically look brown or a drab black or gray. The chartreuses, the greens, the fire tigers, those colors still show up in the dirty water. And I like to think of it as the bass in dirty water are basically like we are in a foggy situation. They can see, but they can't see very well. Their sight is impaired to a certain extent. And what the color does is having chartreuse or fire tiger type color is like having headlights on a car. When the car's coming down the highway, you can see it in the fog, but when it turns its headlights on, you can see it a lot farther away, and it helps those bass pick out your bait. And that's what you're wanting, because remember, he's a sight feeder, so you're wanting him to see it. And even in that dirty water, he can see the chartreuses, he can see the fire tigers. So keep that in mind when you get in those situations. Bass's vision is not equal in all directions. You need to keep in mind that a bass can see the best to the sides, to the front, and above. But you do also need to remember that a bass can almost see 360 degrees around it. The only blind spot the bass really has is directly beneath it. If you keep those angles in mind when you're fishing, you can actually come up to a log. If you have an idea where that bass might be laying, you're going to have a good idea where you need to put your bait to where he's going to have the best chance of seeing him. If you know the bass is right on the end of the log, you know that you're going to have to put that bait in a position to where that bait is going to fall either directly to the side of him, directly in front of him, or it's going to come down right above him. If you get in one of those 3 places, that bass is going to have the best chance of seeing your bait.
Your choice right there, the white with the nickel blades in this color water, all the way up to gin clear water, I think is a real good choice. Now, if we got into dirtier water, then I would think about putting some chartreuse in that bait, maybe a white and chartreuse combination, and also look at gold blades. I really like gold blades in the spinnerbait in dirtier water. Some people like colored blades. Colored blades are getting real popular. Your chartreuse colored blades can be a big, big color. When it comes to jigs, I used to use 10, 15 different colors. I'd carry this big old jig box. And
I remember I had to carry it several times.
But the more I fish, the more I've refined it to just when I get to a lake and I see the watercolor, I tie a jig on to match that watercolor,
And if it's muddy, I like a black and chartreuse colored jig. That seems to be a real good combination. Slightly stained water all the way up to clear water. Your black and blue is a great color. If you're ever lost for colors with a jig, you can't hardly go wrong by tying on a black and blue jig. Clear water situations, I kind of like the browns. This is a chameleon color right here, we call chameleon crawl. Your pumpkin with the green flakes, a good clear water choice, and that's it. You know, we'll get into certain situations where we'll use white if there's a lot of shad around and things like that, but I think if an angler just sticks to the basics, if he looks at the watercolor and takes it from there, he's got it made.
Well, let's talk a little bit about why those colors.
Why.
I might be a little leery to tell you this stuff because you might get too dangerous.
Well,
you might get too good.
You might confuse me.
Well, now that may work. I know you're getting kind of. I've seen.
Over the years, two of the senses have played a major part in my fishing success, feeling and hearing. Even when I designed the Pro Model jig for Strike King, one of the major considerations was sound. We wanted to get a loud rattle in there, so we put a big double barrel rattle to help attract attention from these fish. And even when I've been fishing dirty water at times, I've noticed that bigger, bulkier baits that put out pressure waves give me a little bit more success. Now, how does all this play a scientific part in my fishing?
Well, I think the first thing you need to keep in mind is that when you use sound and feeling to your advantage when bass fishing, it's merely a way of getting their attention, so they look for your bait. Now, there's several different scientific facts that come into play, and we're going to get into those real quick. But just keep in mind, it's just a way of getting their attention. Now let's go on and talk about some of those nasty little scientific facts that I had to study hours for my exams.
Sounds good.
Let's go. How do sound and feel basically work in the water? I said they're almost the same thing, and they are. How they work is that when something hits the water or sound goes into the water, it basically creates a pressure waves, and that pressure waves transmitted through the water and then actually through the bass. The bass are made up almost entirely of water, just basically like we are, and since they live in the water, they're the same density as their environment. So if the bass is the same density as the water and that pressure wave goes right through it, how does the bass know that a pressure wave has went through it? Well, the bass has three organs that are a different density than the water. The first one is the otolith. It's basically like our ear. It's a little stone that's in the middle of their head, and it functions a lot like our ear does. The second is the lateral line. It runs right down the side of almost every fish in the universe. The third is the air bladder. And what that is just a big bubble of air inside the fish that allows it to move itself within the water column. If the bass wants to move shallower in the water column, it needs to put more air into its air bladder, and it does that. When it wants to go deeper, it lets air out of that air bladder. It's basically a control of buoyancy. How can a fisherman use this information about how a fish hears and feels to his advantage? How can he use that to catch more fish? The single most important thing you got to remember is that that fish is still a sight feeder. So you're going to use hearing and feeling to get that fish's attention. You're not going to go out there and throw a spinnerbait in the water and have that blade thumping around creating pressure waves, and that fish is not just going to eat the pressure waves. That pressure wave is going to get that fish's attention to where he starts to look around. Where's that coming from? I see it right over there. It's a spinnerbait? No, it's a shad. I think I'm going to go eat it. That's what you got to keep in mind. The process went. The spinnerbait made noise or made feeling in the water. That fish felt it, and then it started to look. When it saw the spinnerbait, it didn't see the spinnerbait as we saw it. It saw it as a shad. Then it ate it. You used hearing and feeling of that fish to get him to search for your bait. When he finally saw it, he ate it. Hearing and feeling is not something that's going to be magic. You're not going to cast a bait out there that makes a certain rattle or puts out a certain pressure wave that brings fish from miles around to eat it. It's not going to happen. Perhaps in the future, when we have the technology to study sound and pressure waves in water a little bit more thoroughly, we may come up with something like that. For the time being, pressure waves in the water get the fish's attention, and that's what you want. You want his attention, so he's looking for your bait. I get asked a lot at seminars about how important is it to really be quiet when you're fishing in the water, and we're really on a basically shallow water pattern, 3 feet and less, and I feel that it's extremely important to be real quiet when you're fishing, because when you make noises in the boat, they really transfer into the water extremely well. And hey, what are you doing? This is the best looking tree we fished all day.
I'm gonna tie on a new jig.
You know what I do to my partners when they do that? You see the log right there?
We did the bank. I'm on it. I'm on it.
You're out of here. Wow. No problem. No problem. Ah,
Pretty.
that was beautiful. Got to see him come up and hit it and everything.
Water just clear enough where you could see him shoot out from underneath that
I
log.
brought it over the one limb and let it flutter about 6 or 7 inches, and he came up and just absolutely hammered it.
They want that erratic retrieve, it seems like.
Well, a lot of times the bass are generally opportunistic feeders, just like, you know, a lot of other fish are as well, like northern pike. And you've heard the old saying, it's survival of the fittest in the wild, and that's basically true. The bass, if they see something, a piece of prey like an injured shad or something that's weaker than the rest, it's easier for them to get. They've got to spend less energy to get it, and that's something that they're going to eat a lot. So if you can present a bait in that manner to the fish, a lot of times you may trigger 1 or 2 more strikes.
And it was almost like that fish was suspended underneath that limb, and when you brought it over the limb next to it, all of a sudden you just saw this dart. I mean, that was beautiful.
It definitely triggered him when it fluttered over the limb.
You gotta be careful of on a deal like that is jerking before he has
Yeah,
the
definitely.
lure in his mouth.
I could have very easily done that.
Yeah.
And I think I've done it before.
You see him coming, that's real easy to do. That's what happens a lot when people are fishing topwater lures. They jerk on the explosion. Jerk before the fish has it in its mouth.
Never jerk till you can feel them.
That's right. Till the rod loads. That was pretty. Pretty. Not pretty, that was pretty.
Also, sound does not transfer well into water. Me talking right here next to the water, you won't hear it underneath. It doesn't transfer hardly at all. But if we're out in the boat and my partner drops a tackle box in the bottom, fish for miles around hear that tackle box dropping. You have to have something between you and the water to transmit that sound. If you have that, you better be quiet. That's why I have a rule in my boat. The quieter, the better. If you're making noise, I'm going to leave you on the bank. Let's go on and talk a little bit about the smell and taste of the bass. I mentioned earlier that they're probably the 2 least important senses for the bass, and that's really true. Their main function is to complement the other senses. They're really just secondary. A bass doesn't actively go out and start smelling for its food. It's not like a catfish. A catfish, I had a professor tell me once, a catfish is nothing but a swimming tongue. It's got taste buds all over its body. A bass is nothing like that. A bass has a pair of nostrils on its head, just kind of like we got. They don't have a nose like the Brauers have, but they've got 2 nostrils that they can smell with. It's mainly close range. They can't smell a long ways away, but they can smell. They can also taste, and they taste the same way we do. They have a couple holes in the top of their head, in their mouth, that they use to taste with. Now they can only taste things that are inside their mouth, since their taste buds are just like ours, in their mouth. So what does this tell the fisherman? What does it mean to you? How then can you use their smell and taste to have you catch more fish? I think of it kind of as a safety precaution. I use scents all the time. I use them on jigs, I use them on worms, on spinnerbaits, even on topwater. Well, why? I said that smell and taste don't really mean that much to the bass. Well, they don't. How many times in tournaments have I needed 1 more fish to bite to have a great tournament? It's happened to me several times, and I've only been fishing for 3 years. I can't even imagine how many times it's happened to Dad. You know, he's been fishing since like the beginning of time. I hope he's not around anywhere, but I think he's been fishing for like 20-some years. And that's almost as old as I am. And I can't imagine how many more times that he would have given his left arm for 1 more bite. He'd have won several more tournaments. Well, that's why I use scents on all my baits.
Is it that important? I do it for a lot of reasons. You know, sure, it's a scent factor, but everything I see that swims in the water is kind of slimy. And if it just seems like when I put scent on a plastic worm or on a jig, it looks a little more alive in the water. It's reflecting light like something that lives in the water. Now, does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense to me. I think anytime you can make your bait look more like the actual thing, the real bait
Make
fish,
it look alive.
the real crawdad, if you make it look alive, I think you're better off in that situation every time, because you're going to appeal to probably all 5 senses of the fish in that case. It's going to look right, it's going to feel right, they're going to hear the right noises, it's going to smell right, and then it's going to taste right. And when you've got that going, you're probably going to maximize the amount of bites you can get every single day.
There's a couple other points I want to touch on when it comes to scent where it can be an advantage for you. Your bait is going to come through the cover easier. If you're fishing heavy vegetation and you make that bait slimy with some type of scent, it's not going to wrap up on reeds, get caught in the grass, or get wrapped up on the brush. It's going to slide through that cover easier, and it's also going to move in the fish's mouth easier when you set the hook. It's not going to be restricted because of that slime on it, so to speak, that scent. You're probably going to get a better hookup.
Went through the 5 senses now, but there's also some things in that piece just about the bass that are very important to the fisherman, and I call those the physiological characteristics. The first one, and I think probably the most important and maybe the most well-known, is that bass are cold-blooded. And what this simply means is that the water temperature controls their metabolism. In cold water, their metabolism's slow, so they digest food slower. When the water is warmer, their metabolism speeds up, and thus they digest food faster. They have to eat more often. The second is, I call their spawning season. This is mainly, comes into play always in the spring, every year. They move up to spawn. Their reproductive behavior controls a lot of what they do that time of the year. The third physiological characteristic that I consider extremely important for bass fishing is oxygen. They got to have oxygen. They're just like us. They got to be able to breathe. Cold water holds more oxygen than warm water. The hotter the water gets, the less oxygen it can hold.
One thing I noticed was the chameleon craw, the brown color. In the fall of the year, I've had a lot of success with it. It just seems like one of them go-to colors for me. Does water temperature have anything to do with that, or is it seasonal, or how big a part does water temperature play in color selection, fishing areas? I know during the spawning season, I really key on it. I monitor my temperature gauge, and I'm hunting for them coves that are just a little bit warmer, where the fish may be a little more active. But taking it to that scientific angle that you like to take things to, is it a big deal for you, or am I taking it too lightly?
Oh, water temperature is a big deal, but I think sometimes it's overused, but you got to be careful not to underuse it. The two main times that I think water temperature is one of the most important pieces of the fishing jigsaw puzzle is the transition periods, the fall like you were talking about, and the spring. During the summer and winter, I think that water temperature, is really overrated. The only time you might consider it during the winter is when you're in real cold water, and maybe you get 2 or 3 days that are real nice and the water warms up. Then, the water temperature is going to play a part in it, but you're automatically going to think that in your mind. I think the two real times that the people need to keep an eye on the water temperature is when they're starting to move up to spawn in the early spring. You're going to look for the shallow coves that are warming up quicker. Say you get a cove on the north end of the lake that's 2 or 3 degrees warmer. That's going to make a big difference. And the same goes in the fall when they're moving to the backs of the creeks. You get in some of the backs of the creeks that are, say, 2 to 3 degrees cooler. The fish are going to be in there and probably be a little more active. I think the keys that you really need to keep in mind when using water temperature are that it's not always the most important factor. Of course, fish are cold-blooded, so they're really keyed into the temperature. But the surface water temperature that most people are taking is really only useful in shallow water. If you're taking the surface water temperature and fishing in 20 foot of water, you're basically getting useless information. There are oftentimes more important pieces to the puzzle than water temperature. The reproductive cycle plays an important part. The water color is probably the most important thing that you need for color selection. I don't think water temperature really plays much of a part in that. Thinking what exactly the fish are eating plays a part. Just keep in mind that water temperature is very important, especially in the transition periods when they're moving from shallow water to deep water or from deep water to shallow water.
There's something I think as fishermen we need to keep in mind, and that's that there's a broad temperature range we can catch them in. Because I can remember years ago when we lived in Nebraska, we'd catch them through the ice fishing, and there's been many a times fishing open water. I've caught them in 38, 39 degree water, and we've caught them in water temperatures up into the 90s. But you can take, say, 60 degree water temperature, what a lot of people would consider ideal water temperature for catching big fish. 60 degree water temperature that's warming up is a lot better situation than 60 degree water temperature where it had been 65 degrees the day before and all of a sudden it dropped 5 degrees. That may have turned those fish off. So water temperature, which direction it's going at different seasons can play an important part.
I think it's really useful in the short term, from day to day, thinking how fast you need to fish. Say you get a big cold front move through on one night and the surface water temperature drops 3 or 4 degrees.
Right.
That's going to automatically tell the fisherman, hey, that fish's metabolism slowed down pretty significantly.
Slow down.
Yeah, so he probably needs to slow down as well. And the same goes when it warms up. Hey, if it's warming up, 2 or 3 degrees a day, maybe I can just keep speeding my retrieve up. And it's a real useful tool when you're talking day to day.
And what it causes me to do a lot of times is where I'd been making one pitch with a jig to a stump or to a tree, we get that drop in water temperature, I'm going to sit and make 15, 20 presentations because I know that fish isn't as active.
Yep, exactly. You get out every morning fishing and you start to get bit, like we've actually caught one already off this log. That's when you can start to talk to the fish. Let them tell you what they're doing. Before you even get to the water, you should have a general idea what you need to be doing and what the fish might be doing and how you need to fish to catch them. But once you get a couple bites, then you can start to really narrow it down to specifics. Just take, for example, Dad caught this fish out on the end of the log, out on the part of the log you can't even see, it's underwater. Pretty much laying pretty tight to the cover, which would seem pretty logical because we just had a pretty major cold front roll through. We had about 2 straight weeks of 90-degree weather, and this morning it's down in the 50s. So the fish you would assume, would be fairly tight to the cover already, and that fish kind of gives us an indication that we might be right. Now that's about a 30-degree drop in air temperature, which would relate to basically 4 or 5, maybe up to 10-degree temperature change in the lake water because of the rain that came through with it. I'd basically probably go with 2 baits. The first one being spinner bait like I'm throwing, this little elite spinner bait from Strike King. A fairly small profile, trying to match the bait fish like we talked about, matching the hat. There's tons of bait. I'd probably circle around it maybe once with a spinner bait, trying to hit all the logical places where the fish might be, especially the ends of the log. And then I'd come back through with what you're throwing, the jig. Probably 3/8. We're fishing fairly shallow in this type of year. With these type of conditions in this type of the year, they'd probably want a little slower presentation, and it'd also give them something different to look at. Oh, there's one. Hey, all right. Look at it. He snuck the jig out on me and behind me, and is trying to catch the fish.
He didn't want that spinner. I caught the bait out of there actually swimming, and he come up and grabbed it.
Let's talk a second about what that might mean and what you can learn from what that fish just did. All right, you said that it basically followed the jig out from the log. Look in the background here, we've got 4 or 5 herons sitting in the background eating bait. So we've got plenty of bait fish. The fish chases the bait off of the log, meaning that he's probably fairly aggressive looking for some bait fish, used to a bunch of the bait fish coming by, but why then would he eat the jig?
You tell me.
I would venture a guess that it's something different. He has seen 10,000 bait fish swimming by, so why would he eat a spinnerbait? He's got millions of real bait fish to eat from, but he sees something different swimming by, and they're curious. They're going to come out and maybe eat it.
So at times, what you're saying is you don't want to match the hatch. You want to give them something totally different.
Exactly.
To trigger a strike. Right?
Exactly, especially when you're in this type of situation where you've got so many bait fish around that your bait's not going to stick out that much. They've got millions of bait fish to eat. Why are they going to choose your spinnerbait unless you absolutely hit them in the head with it? Maybe a jig's going to give you 1 or 2 more strikes.
Here all along, I just thought I was a better fisherman.
Well, that may have something to do with it too. Let's see if we can't catch another one off the end of this log. Number 2 off that log. They're almost twins too, I think. Now, where do I think oxygen really plays a part in my fishing? It's mainly in the summertime. I've always lived on Lake of the Ozarks, and it's a big reservoir. Every summer we have an occurrence called a thermocline. Now, what happens in the thermocline is that in spring, the surface water heats up gradually. Cold water is denser than hot water. Cold water thus sinks. So when you have hot water on top in the spring and cold water below it, you don't get any mixing. The cold water stays down there and the hot water stays on top. Now when you get to a certain level, when you get to a certain difference between the top and the bottom, you're not going to have any mixing whatsoever. Then what occurs there is a separation. You've got cold water down here at the bottom, hot water at the top. Where they meet, you get a 3 or 4 foot zone where it just barely mixes. And what happens there is up here you've got a lot of algae, some fairly warm water, good growing environment for the algae, with one exception. They don't have enough nutrients. Well, this bottom level, there's all this decomposition going on, and it's giving off nutrients. It's got nutrients to spare. Well, when those two things meet, you have an algae bloom in the summertime. On my home lake, it's generally around 25 foot. What happens there, you get that huge algae bloom. Now you just follow the food chain up. Where you've got algae, you've got zooplankton. The zooplankton eat up all the algae that they can. Well, what eats zooplankton? Bait fish eat zooplankton. Well, what eats the bait fish then? The bass. So what I try to look for when I find that thermocline situation is any piece of structure I can find at right around the thermocline, right around that 25-foot zone. If there's a brush pile underneath the dock at 25 feet, that's an ideal place for the fish to be hanging around.
One period of the year that I've had huge problems at times catching fish is the fall period of the year. And I get into situations, Chad, where I'll pull into a backwater area, a cove, and I see all this gunk floating on the water, stuff that's releasing off the bottom. And everybody, for years we've called it fall turnover. What does that actually do? How does it play a part in affecting our fishing?
Fall turnover is really quite related to the summer thermocline. What basically happens is when you got your fall cooling down, the air's starting to turn cooler, the leaves are turning, you're starting to do a little deer hunting, and probably that might be the problem why you don't catch very many fish in fall, is you deer hunt more than you fish. But that's all right.
Have you ever tried eating a pork frog?
No, I haven't. I don't think.
Explain to the folks about fall turnover. Don't insult your father on tape.
What happens during fall turnover is the surface layer that used to be warmer than the bottom, bottom cooler layer, is cooling down. When those two layers reach the same temperature, they can mix. When the top layer really gets colder, the top layer is going to sink. And when that happens, you've got your fall turnover. I think it probably happens significantly enough. It's kind of sucks some of that gunk right off the bottom, and that's what you see on top. The conditions that you have then is you have a very uniform water column. Conditions are almost the same from the surface of the water clear down to the bottom. And my theory on this is why this is a tough fishing time is that the fish can simply go anywhere and have the same conditions.
Yeah, I've always, even at my seminars, stressed to the other fishermen, and really have followed the practice myself, to pay attention to the weather a week or two leading up to when you're going to a certain area to fish. If you've got a fishing trip planned for next weekend, it's very easy to monitor what the weather's doing and then fish accordingly. Let that weather tell you something. There's a lot of other factors like rising water, dropping water that all play a part. But if I've got what I call positive weather, good weather, it's been stable, I would think that the fish are going to be pretty active. Fishing's going to be pretty good. If I've got some of them negative conditions going through, like dropping water temperature and high bright skies, say after a cold front, you should kind of realize fishing's going to be bad. Slow down. You know, that's when we get out the flipping sticks, sit there, and you know, we like those conditions.
That's what I like.
But that's just because a lot of other things don't work, and that's our favorite style of fishing. That's why we like it. But that's when a lot of people have trouble, and that's what they need to look at. You know, if the conditions are great, they should be biting. Fish faster.
Pay attention to the weather, what it's been doing over the past week or two. It's going to give you a great idea of what all the environmental factors are going to be in that body of water before you even get there. So you're going to have a better idea how to catch the fish faster. How many times does that happen?
You got to be the luckiest person.
Yeah! I think it's skill.
That was lucky, folks.
No.
He was hung up on the tree, snapped the spinnerbait loose, the water, and that fish grabbed it.
I absolutely knew that fish was right there.
Nothing scientific about that. That was just pure luck.
I've noticed that fish will set up on cover in certain ways according to how the wind blows. Once in a while they'll be on the upwind side. Is there some scientific reason for this that is pushing plankton or whatever you call it around in the water? Or what's the deal?
That certainly would probably have something to do with it. That's a very tough question to try and put an exact explanation on what the wind does to the fish, because the fish don't actually feel any of the wind. What it basically does is it just breaks up the surface of the water. And I think probably more than anything, that's the reason that wind often plays a part in improving the fishing. Is just to stir the water up a little bit and break up the outline of the top and move the bait fish around. What the bait fish will actually do with the wind is, a lot of times on a major body of water, when you've got a pretty good breeze blowing, it'll blow a lot of the plankton and stuff to one end of the lake, and the bait fish are always following the plankton.
I've had some really good days on windy banks, a lot more so than some calm bank. It seems like the only time I do well in them real calm areas is, say, spawning season, cold water situations where they're wanting a warmer, calmer situation where the water's warming up. But other than that, if I can get on them windy banks with a spinnerbait, boy, I can hurt them. Seems like the fish are more active.
That would be my best guess. Blowing the plankton and then the bait fish, getting them in there, and you're talking about catching them on a spinnerbait. That would seem very logical. The spinnerbait's looks like a bait fish, and when you get all those bait fish coming into an area, following the plankton, well, look at there, I had a little white bass follow my spinnerbait up.
Over the years, our sport has really developed as far as different angles on how to fish, different ways to select areas. We've got excellent depth finders, we've got oxygen meters. There's all kinds of tools of trade, so to speak. One thing that we hear a lot about, we've read a lot about the last few years, is pH. Well, what are your feelings on pH? Is that something I should monitor? I don't. I go fishing, and if it looks good, I fish there. But am I losing something by not monitoring pH?
I would say no, and let me explain why. People who use pH and have confidence in it, that's great. Why do I not use pH? I don't feel it's very measurable. Something about pH is that it changes throughout the day. The pH out here underneath the boat is different than the pH right next to that log over there. Vegetation changes the pH. There's too much variation, and it's not measurable, in my opinion, to be useful to the fishermen. It's also not very predictable. It's hard for the fishermen to say, oh, it rained last night, what's that going to do to the pH where I'm fishing? It's cloudy out, how's that going to change the pH? All those things have an effect on the pH of the water. So you may catch a fish off of a stump that you've measured the pH at, and it was perfect. Well, you catch a fish off it, you come back 2 hours later, the pH is completely different. I don't use it simply because I don't feel it's measurable and it's too hard to predict.
What you're saying makes a lot of sense, because I remember early in my tournament career, we fished a lake called Lake Bistineau down in Louisiana. And I'm pulling into this pretty large cove in practice, and an angler that's coming out had been really into monitoring pH. And he said, you might as well not even go in there and fish. He says, the pH is all wrong, the bass aren't going to be there. Well, I went in there and almost won the tournament. I ended up, I think, finishing 5th. What I was doing was catching the fish out from underneath the cypress tree roots on jigs and spinnerbaits. And I'm sure underneath those trees, the pH was totally different than where this guy had measured it out in the middle of the cove. So you've got these little areas in there where maybe, yeah, I did force them to those trees, but I don't know if we can totally rule an area out by some meter. I think we really need to use common sense. And if we see bait fish or if we see fish movement, maybe we ought to be fishing.
Exactly.
Folks, this has been like a dream come true for me. To get to shoot a video with my son, Chad. It's been very interesting. I think, as you will agree, we've hit some different angles. He's really enlightened me, along with, I think, you, on some new angles to catching fish, the reasons why. You want to kind of highlight some of these things before we call it a day?
I think I could probably do that. I think some of the highlights that you need to definitely keep in mind is try and use all 5 senses of the fish to your advantage. I think that'll give you the maximum amount of bites out of every day. Keep in mind all the different aspects of the environment that are going to affect the fish, and try and think ahead of how they might be affecting the fish before you even get to the body of water. The fish, the bass in particular, are ambush feeders. They love to ambush things. And to ambush, you need to be hidden and let something swim by. Well, there's no better hiding place than a dark, shady spot. So that's kind of logical. But what I thought was interesting, when I read this article I've been talking about, they had studied something about the bass and the bait fish and the difference in their eyes. And it turned out that the bass can see better than the bait fish in dark light situations such as shade or cloudy days, whereas the bait fish could see better than the bass on bright sunny conditions. So it'd be advantageous for the bass to be hidden, sit in the shady spot, or on cloudy days they could also roam around because they're going to have better vision than the bait fish. And anytime you get an advantage like that in the wild, it's survival of the fittest. The bass has the advantage over their bait fish.
So you really did read this?
I read this. I'm telling you, I've read articles.
At least this time it's not over 100 articles.
Well, I don't want to blow it out of 10,000 bait fish swimming by. So why would he eat a spinnerbait? He's got millions of real bait fish to eat from, but he sees something different swimming by and they're curious. They're going to come out and maybe eat it.
So at times what you're saying is you don't want to match the hatch. You want to give them something totally different.
Exactly.
To trigger a strike.
I'm going to get crazy.
Get crazy on it.
I'm going crazy here. The fishes, their gills, the way they take in oxygen, their blood flow through the gills is in a direction to where it is exposed to the surface where the water meets it as much as it can, and it pulls oxygen out of the water. But when you get in the current, if the fish is facing into the current, it's automatically going in their mouth and out their gills. And that's what they're used to, because when they're sitting in still water, that's how they move water through their passageway. Well, if they're facing down current and the current's coming from behind them, the water's pushing up into their gills, and that's creating, the blood's going in one direction that's most advantageous for them. Well, now the water's moved in a different direction, so that's changed their whole perspective. They can't draw oxygen out of the water as efficiently as they can if they're facing into the current. Is that wild or what?
Well, that totally explains it, though.
Yeah.
They really have to position themselves that way.
I mean, it's totally advantageous for them to face into the current. It's a blue heron sitting out on a log. Now, how do we use that to find fish? A blue heron is a classic fisherman. It's kind of like a loon. It's a fisher bird. It eats small bait fish such as shad. And anytime you can find blue heron on a log, out on a flat, walking the bank, you know that there's going to be bait fish nearby.
Well, something I've always tried to do on the larger bodies of water during a tournament situation when I encounter what I consider fall turnover, negative water conditions, is move. you can move 5-10 miles away from that area, and a lot of times get into an area of the lake that had turned over a couple weeks earlier or hadn't turned over, different water quality, because not a whole giant reservoir will turn over at the same time.
No.
Am I correct?
You know, one end will generally be warmer than the other.
On certain occasions where I've been trapped in an area where I couldn't get away from what I call the gunk water, where all the stuff's releasing from the bottom, is it seemed like the shallower I fished, the more successful I was.
Maybe your fishing style
Maybe
even.
because I'm not fishing
That's
deeper
right.
than
Maybe
2
you
feet.
don't go deeper than 2
That
feet.
might have something to do with it, folks.
But when I was starting to swim it away from the cover, he finally decided he wanted it, and he grabbed it. Kind of a weird bite, but I'll take him anyway.
That's
they want to
right.
bite it.
I've never met a bad bite.
Times we fish through big schools of fish because for whatever reason it might be, they're just not biting.
That was the lesson we took from that tournament. I fished through, I probably fished through the winning school of fish in practice. The first day I went up there, and I fished the same pattern that I ended up fishing in the tournament for about 6 hours in the morning. I caught like 2 fish. Well, I quit fishing that pattern about at the same time during the tournament when we started catching them. I fished it until about 11, 12 o'clock in the day, and then fished different patterns the rest of the day. Well, in the tournament, we'd fish that pattern in the morning, catch 2 or 3, but at noon, somewhere around noon, and between when we were there and when we weighed in, we'd catch, one day I caught 15 or 20 in about 3 hours.
Awesome.
And you know, you never can tell. There's some factors that you just cannot explain, and that's the same way throughout nature. There's just some things we're never going to explain.
That's good though.
And that's the
That's
way,
what keeps it
that's what makes it
interesting.
interesting, and that's why we keep learning.
Trying to put those pieces of that puzzle together.
If someone ever figures it all out, they may be really dangerous on the tournament circuit. I'd like to urge everybody out there, take care of all the natural resources that we have, because taking care of the environment is a lot like a guy jumping off a cliff. Once you go off, when you're halfway down, sure, hey, I'm doing all right, we're fine. When you hit the bottom, it's all over. It's the same way with the environment. You don't know how bad you've got it till you hit the bottom, and then it's too late. I hope you folks have learned a lot, and we'll see you out there on the water.
And make sure you buy a dozen of my jigs. Thank you.
All right.
I think that's great. Oh, there we go.
Okay.
Okay.
We both do it.
All right.
1,
What are we going to count to let him go?
1,
You ready to let him go?
3, 2, 1, go!
Give me 5. Yay!
You gotta go to Kobe's Point.
That's where you always catch them.
But we better know.
We better? You want me to hold the rod? Is a lot like a guy jumping off a cliff. Once you go off, when you're halfway down, sure, hey, I'm doing all right, we're fine. When you hit the bottom, it's all over. It's the same way with the environment. You don't know how bad you've got it till you hit the bottom, and then it's too late.